Payson McElveen, welcome to Second Nature. Are we recording, Lucy?
We are recording. This is the moment, man. Like I said, I have somehow, or we have collectively managed to pull together some of the busiest, most active athlete podcasters on the planet, especially in the endurance space. You guys are two of the best, actually. It's going to be a fun conversation.
Well,
Yeah, I was
who
about to
got us
say
started? Who got
it's all
both
your
of us
fault, Lucy.
started?
It is a point of pride that I've guilted both of you into a career of podcasting.
I think that would be a good place to start, actually, with you, Aaron. Payson and I were, of the same vintage. Aaron Lutzi recruited athletes to Red Bull. Maybe prime the listeners about, your history with Payson, our guest, and what makes him special in the industry.
To be fair, I didn't do the recruiting, although I had a little bit of a little bit of the thumb on the scale in the background. But I did not do the original signing. But I then got to pick up and work with Payson once he was in the door, which was very exciting. I was the bike guy at Red Bull, so thankfully got a chance to spend quite a bit of time with Payson working together, which was awesome. Do you want me to talk about the podcast conversation? Is that where you want me to take it?
Well, sure.
And like how we started?
Eventually, we got to get there, so you might as well dive in.
I don't know if you guys actually even know this story, but I'd love to share it with you. Maybe you've heard it before. Apologies if you have. But one of the reasons why we came to both of you guys, and specifically, actually in Payson's case, we got to give a shout out to Luke Westonage, who had a big hand in it too. But one of the things that really motivated me to push you guys hard into this idea of content creation was actually a really rough moment at Red Bull where there was an athlete that I managed who I absolutely loved and looked up to and had looked up to for a very long time as an athlete. And as it can sometimes happen, you have to end contracts with athletes. We call it graduation in Red Bull, where you've kind of like done everything you're going to do and it's time to move on to the next thing. But you both know that being a Red Bull athlete is sort of part of your identity at this stage because you've been athletes for so long. And so the end of that ride would be pretty jarring for people. And I remember being in that room with the, other people from the athlete marketing team and this athlete directly. And we asked, like, well, what are you going to do now? And we had given this athlete, as much help as we possibly could to like let them know that the end was coming and all this stuff. But it was really clear to me that this athlete didn't have really a plan B, didn't have anything else. And part of the reason why the contract was ending was that they were no longer competitive, which happens to every athlete too. But there was no plan B. There was no long-term strategy in place because they had just been focused on being a really good athlete, which is what most athletes do. And I kind of left that meeting more shaken than usual. I had graduated at more than a few athletes at that point. It wasn't a new thing. It's part of the deal. The best part about being an athlete manager is when you get to give somebody that Red Bull helmet. The worst part is when you have to take it back. And unfortunately, that's the life cycle. Thankfully, at Red Bull, that life cycle is a 10 to 15 year give or take. But it does happen and it is part of the deal. And we do everything we possibly can to fight and push that date off as far as we can, even as athlete managers, partially because we know that there's always more stuff you can do with an athlete to activate the partnership, but also because we hate that conversation just as much as the athlete does. But after this conversation, I was completely shaken because I just saw this athlete's world crumble. Like, whoa, he has no idea what he's going to do next. I don't ever want to have to experience this ever again. I felt really terrible and it wasn't my fault, but I thought to myself, what could I do to prevent this scenario from ever happening again? And that's maybe, a little, I don't know the right word for it, but yeah, I just thought, what can I do? What can I put in place? What would need to be true for an athlete to be valuable to a brand forever? And around the same time, our buddy Grand Pooh Bear came into the mix at Red Bull. And I saw how creating a community through content, which is what he was doing through gaming, like, oh, what if you could do that, but for traditional athletes, not just gaming, but what if you could use content to build a community? Because this guy, even if he's not breaking a world record for video games, whatever, people still care about this guy day in and day out. There's something really, really valuable. And while a lot of people at Red Bull were like, huh, gaming, I'm not getting anywhere close to that. That's not sports. I saw the value of like, wait, there's something here with content and community that is incredibly value. How do we translate that? And that's where I came to both of you to say, we got to figure this out. Not that either one of you were ever in danger of, being graduated in that era, but thinking long term of, if this were true, this would extend their career. And even if they weren't competitive, they would have this like long term plan B. And that's why I pushed you so hard.
So that you wouldn't have to eventually fire us.
Yeah, basically. This is all self preservation.
Payson, maybe share the story about you getting that helmet for the first time, and then because you were brought in at a younger age than I was, and I recall I was one of the earliest guests on your podcast, which you set up almost right away. Of course, you'd accomplished some things at that point. I think you were a double USA champion at that point, but still early in your career and at a young age. So you sort of had more foresight in terms of marrying performance with content creation, community building, certainly than I did.
Yeah, boy, when I think back on that time, it almost feels a lifetime ago. When Lutzi said the typical life cycle of a Red Bull athlete is 10 to 15 years, I was like, oh man, how many years has it been? I feel like it's been at least 10. No, it was 2000, I want to say late 2017, early 2018. I think. And it was so, and a lot of how the process goes for signing an athlete, is kept close to the chest, I think, by Red Bull. So I don't know all the ins and outs. I'm sure, Debo, you don't know all the ins and outs. That's maybe one of the few things that Lutzi can never tell us. I don't know. maybe when we're like 20 years down the line, he can share a little bit more about that. But I don't even remember how Red Bull first got in touch, but I remember getting ice cream with Chase Garrett in Leadville. And it was a year after I'd podiumed Leadville and I'd won national champs that year, marathon national champs. And I'd already been on Red Bull's radar, I think, before those successes, but those kind of created more momentum. And at some point, like I was saying, I'd love to hear the full download on, why they kind of zeroed in on me or why they kind of zeroed in on you, Dylan. But I think some of it was I was always putting out these sort of like awkward content pieces that were kind of on a weekly basis. They weren't quite blogs; they were sort of like newsletters, and they were always, good-hearted attempts, but they weren't very polished, and I mean, they just weren't very good. But I always was trying something new. And I don't know if that's something that caught their attention, but
I actually specifically remember you'd made one about wheeling around
oh
Durango,
yeah,
or maybe Austin it was. That video made the rounds at Red Bull, and they were trying to show like, oh, this guy does more than just racing. He actually makes stuff too. And I think that, I don't actually think it's that much of a secret. I think that Red Bull looks for talent that is on the way up, where they can play a role in sort of the rise of that athlete. They don't want to hire or sponsor an established athlete. They want to find somebody that's on their way up, but they also want to find someone who is sort of multifaceted, where they have something else to offer. So in Dylan's case, for example, when I pitched Dylan, he had, of course, like some results that he had already achieved. He had like a little bit of a running start, but then part of the thing, and maybe one of the most powerful parts of that presentation, I had a 3-year plan that I pitched because I knew what races Dylan was going to go to. I knew some of the project ideas for FKTs that he had in mind. And so I could give Red Bull this idea of like, hey, this is the stuff that he's going to be doing and stuff that we could partner with him in and build this thing up. And I think in the same way for you, you had demonstrated some success. I think you might have even been on like a Devo team at that point, but you had demonstrated success and you were doing stuff other than just racing. And we didn't know that it would eventually turn into a podcast at the time, but the fact that you were able to do something more than just racing, it shifts you out of this category. When you're just racing, you're competing against hundreds, if not thousands of people. If you're racing plus making content, that funnels it down quite a bit. And I think the other thing that Red Bull tries to do is they try to find sort of 1 to 2 representatives, and a lot of times it's like a male and female representative for a sport, because for them it's about introducing people to the brand and the product, as opposed to like being super deep in a category. Of if you look at, yes, Red Bull across all of mountain biking, there's lots of mountain bike athletes on Red Bull, but how many per country are there? Not that many, right? And so it's sort of like that. Like we had Kate and we had you. So we had like a little bit of cross country, some representation in either one. And, I don't want to make you feel bad, but like there have been other cross country mountain bikers that would have been deserving recipients of the helmet that we didn't bring on because we had Payson.
Yeah. I mean, to get back to Debo's original question, when I first got the helmet, I think up until that point, there was a lot of like raw materials. I had this for whatever reason deep desire to just create that I could never put to bed. So even when I had bad ideas, I just had to see them through. And then there was also the component of the racing. Like I love racing so much, and I love training more than anything. And these are the two things that I really love doing. But they weren't necessarily cohesive. I wasn't necessarily telling good stories about those things, or not as good as I could have. And so I remember when I was given the Red Bull helmet, it was kind of like, okay, now is the time where I need to step up and like really absolutely put the pieces in place the best that I absolutely can. I've done a lot of dabbling, like how do we focus and actually execute? And two, just a lot of confidence that Red Bull was going to help me do that, because that's the legacy of the brand, right? They provide that spark and they provide that structure and that support to take maybe somewhat raw, more rough materials and help polish them and help them reach new heights. So I remember vividly, sitting at the kitchen table and holding my first helmet, and it felt, of course, so significant and just really exciting, and like, okay, this is the next step. And I can't wait to see what happens next. And you're right, the podcast didn't come that long later, but I wasn't excited at first about the podcast as the thing, because even then in 2019, when finally, I think 2018 is when Lucy started kind of like pitching this podcast idea. 2019 is when I actually committed to doing it. Even back then, 7 years ago, it felt kind of bandwagony to start a podcast. I was like, everyone has podcasts. This is pre-pandemic. The pandemic is when podcasting just like went through the roof. Literally everyone had a podcast. But I remember in 2019, I was like, man, Lutzy, are you sure? Like, it sure seems like a lot of people have podcasts. He's like, no, dude, I promise. And finally, what convinced me is, and I can't remember exactly how you framed it, Aaron, but it was you either literally put a list in front of me, or you had me do kind of a thought exercise where you were like, I can't remember. It was something along the lines of, give me a list of the people that you've had meaningful conversations with in the last month. Now go down that list and ask yourself if those are interesting people that the world would like to hear from. And like, just basically reflect on the conversations that you've had with those people. And in the past month, there was all kinds of people, lots of Red Bull athletes, Johnny Collinson, and, whole list. Basically, it became like the first 10 episodes. But that was the thing that kind of made it click for me, where I was like, oh, so I do have a unique opportunity here because of these other athletes, personalities, people that I get to hang out with just because of the sport that I'm doing and the network. That is unique. And the thing that I was hung up on is that I wasn't sure I had something unique to offer, and you were the one that convinced me that potentially I did. So thank you.
Dylan, how does that track for you?
I did the exact
experience?
Same thing for me. I remember creating a list, or Lutzy presenting me with like, hey, here's all the people I know who your audience would probably enjoy hearing from. And it was people like Payson and Gwen Jorgensen, and it's hard to remember exactly, but the Red Bull universe, the people who are at least in some way loosely connected to Red Bull and or Aaron. And then, the snowball makes its way down the mountain, starts carrying momentum. And then it was up to Payson and I to really refine our format, our voice, and the way that we wanted to approach the sport. And maybe that would be an interesting way to extend this conversation, because, now looking at where the Adventure Stache is and where Free Trail is, both are very established in our communities, but also very different, right? Like, the Adventure Stache is a very authentic perspective from a pro in conversation, a lot of cases with other pros, both before and after races, kind of sharing the really like, informed perspective of the people who are in the fight and in the game, right? We're now more of sort of like an external coverage based media company.
You're
Obviously,
the ringer.
as a
You're the ringer of Ultra.
accelerate, we try to be, but I don't know. I think that's an interesting thing that we in hindsight, it's not necessarily obvious where those decisions happened, but at a certain point, these things start to take on a life of their own, and they become what they're meant to be in some cases. I don't know if there's anything interesting there, or things that you've done along the way, Payson, where you have like intentionally kept the Adventure Stache in a certain format rather than extending in a different
Yeah,
direction.
man. I mean, it's honestly something I think about a lot, and I actually have been thinking about it more in the last couple of years while watching what you're building, because as you started to kind of wind down being a top level pro athlete yourself, you've gone all in on this other thing, and I know that is a future step for me. And so I often ask myself, what will my version of basically free trail be? Because I think it's sort of a natural progression, and I think you and I are we have a lot of similar interests. We've talked about this before. We follow a lot of the same podcasts outside of our sports, are inspired by them. The media, entities that kind of do it best. For me, well, a couple things. We're actually about to do a rebrand for the first time. So this is one funny piece where I think going back to 2019 with Lutzi like kind of dragging me kicking and screaming to start a podcast, I probably did not take seriously as much as I should the actual brand. So the name, the logo's fun for sure, but it didn't leave a ton of freedom for the future, and neither did the name. The name is very odd. It's like, I don't know where we got that. It was probably a joke one night, at dinner or something. For all I know, Lutzi came up with it. I don't know. No, I'm kidding.
I had nothing to do with it.
But we're going to do a rebrand kind of with this eye of, not that I'm looking at retiring from racing anytime soon, but just creating more freedom for the future. And in regards to why we've stuck with the format that we have, I mean, you're describing it well. It's pretty gritty. It's like very one-on-one. Two things there. One, it's just what I'm drawn to. Like I think I'm, for better or worse, like really a feeler and just very, very interested in the human experience of others. And so, as an example, and I'm such a fan of the sport. So just as an example, being here in Girona this winter is such a cool opportunity for me as a fan of the sport, as a historian of the sport, because it's just chock full of professional cyclists. And one of the guys that I had on the podcast not too long ago is this guy, Thomas de Gent, who's won stages in all 3 Grand Tours, retired from the World Tour last year, and is now transitioned over to gravel racing. So he's in his first year leading a full gravel team. But there was a year at the Giro d'Italia where he kind of came out of nowhere and finished 3rd overall and won what is by many considered like the most epic stage in any Grand Tour. So there's kind of Alpe d'Huez, and then there's the Stelvio in Italy. And this is back when the Giro used to do just absolutely stupid hard stages, like 7 hours. Week 3, stage 20, you're going up, finishing on top of this mountain, 4,000 plus foot climb, snow banks that are 3-4 meters tall. And Thomas just had the most epic day and just won in this crazy, crazy fashion. And I've always had that win in my mind as a little bit of inspiration, just as a fan of the sport. And so having him on the podcast and being able to sit across from this legend and ask him every single detailed question about how he won that day, what it was like, what his strategy was like. It was 2012, so there was a lot of stuff we didn't know about fueling strategies, about pacing, about training. People weren't really doing altitude training, all that sort of thing. and just like really peeling back all the layers to the point where it almost feels like a therapy session to him. And spending a full hour where you're like, in the first 10 minutes, he doesn't really trust me. By minute 20, he's opening up a little bit more. And then by or in the last 15 minutes, he's like spilling his guts about what it was like to be this athlete in this moment. And that's what gets me really fired up, because that's kind of the headspace that I'm in as an athlete. And it's something that I think I'm uniquely positioned to do in cycling. So there will come a time where we try to bring more people in to help, maybe have other voices involved, like you do, but I don't know when that'll be. Not soon.
I got to hear more about this rebrand thing. So are you thinking about changing the name of the whole entity to have it feel like more of a media company rather than, so that you have optionality to extend past Payson's podcast into something larger?
Yep. When will this go live? This episode?
Probably like 2 weeks. We got a good backlog going right now. We can hold it too. If you
want.
Let's
just talk about it. I mean, this could be helpful. So it's going to.
Yeah, no, this is helpful. This is exactly what our audience would be interested to hear, like the nuts and bolts of actually operating it, the consideration that goes behind it, and, just like all of it.
Yeah. So it's going to be called With Pace, which is we wrestled with names for so long to the point where I just got really frustrated. And finally, we just hired someone who does this for a living. And I kid you not, within 48 hours, she was just like, how about With Pace? And she presented a logo, and it's an awesome logo, some of my favorite colors. And it sort of has my name in it, but it evokes, some basics as to the actual content, but it also leaves things really open. We could, in theory, With Pace, With Pace podcast, With Pace video series, With Pace events, who knows? Like there's so many directions you could go with that. And actually this person is Rachel Peck, Lachlan Morton's wife. And she's so good at what she does. And it was such a lesson in just fucking hire professional, like don't try to do everything yourself. There are professional graphic designers and people who specialize in rebrands and branding and all that sort of thing. Go figure. They're really good at it. So we'll be rolling that out right before Sea Otter. And one of the things that we're adding is basically a visual component of the podcast. We've been asked for so long to have basically studio interviews that go on YouTube. And I don't think people quite understand what a lift that is, to have 3 camera angles, video editing. You basically have to add a full-time employee when it's all said and done. It sounds crazy, but you basically have to add a full-time employee. So rather than do that, we're kind of leaning into another thing that I've just always enjoyed, which is filmmaking, and we're kind of combining the two. So we're still kind of workshopping the name, but it's probably going to be Riding with Pace. And for each of the 6 rounds of the Grand Prix, we're basically going to have lav mics on me and then plant a couple on my competitors and basically capture everything that happens directly outside the race. So as we're warming up, that sort of like tension that happens right before the race, the little small talk conversations that happen maybe on the start line, directly following the race, that download that happens just athlete to athlete before you do any interviews. And then one of the coolest things we've sort of uncovered, and we just filmed episode 1 here in Girona last month, is basically doing a podcast on bikes. So throwing a lav mic on a buddy, throwing a lav mic on me, and we basically just ride behind a car for like 45 minutes or an hour, and we just have the conversation that we have on a 6-hour bike ride. And so there'll be this like YouTube visual piece to kind of start to build out another element that people have been asking for a while. It's not really what they asked for, but it's what I want to do. So that's sort of the next step this year.
I love it. Lucy just texted me the new podcast cover.
Oh, cool.
Art, so looks fire. Looks fire.
You know what I think is so cool with both of you guys is that you are the practitioners, you are in the trenches, and you are complete fans of your sport. And so while people might be asking you, Payson, for a studio interview, the thing that you actually want to see is what you're going to make. And probably people don't even know that that's an option. So why would they have asked for it? You're going to give the sport and the fans, something that maybe they hadn't asked for, but they're going to appreciate on a deeper level because it's the kind of stuff that you would want to see. It was the kind of stuff you'd want to experience as a fan of the sport. And I think both of your engagement with the history and fandom of your individual sports has such a outsized impact on everything that you're now making when it comes to
Yeah,
all
I
this
mean,
stuff.
dude, to be honest, sometimes I feel like such a nerd within my own sport because like I'll get so fired up about my competitors, and a lot of the other people I race against, it's very natural to be when you're competitors and you're going at each other's throat, from February through October. I think it's very normal to be a little bit standoffish, but I just don't operate that way. I find myself like almost interrogating some of the guys I'm going to battle against, and I can see them kind of tense up like, wait, what's going on here? Is he playing some kind of trick? But it's just really, I just have such an appreciation and passion for what it takes to be good. And yeah, I just find myself slipping back into that often, but I think I'm a bit unusual in that regard.
I'm looking for something here on Twitter that I saw this morning that I'm not going to be able to find, but you guys, oh, here it is. I just found it. Perfect. So somebody asks, Paul Graham, the guy who founded Y Combinator,
Uh-huh.
he put up something, that's about startup, stuff and operations and thinking from the perspective of a customer or whatever. And somebody responded to his tweet, "What's the simplest way to identify what users want, Paul?" And his response is to be one. And I just love that, right? Because like what you're describing with your new video project is like, how do you know what people want? It's like, well, this is what I want, right? So, and I'm a user of this product. So therefore I think I have some unique insight, actually going back to the conversation that just went up today with Steve Holmberg, all about consumer insights, is like the best way to have an insight into what people want is to be that person, right? And it's easier for you and I think, to speak with an authentic voice because we're fans, right?
For sure.
I think a lot about the analogy of surfing when it comes to everything that we're collectively doing with our content creation and podcasts and everything else, in that when you're surfing, your goal is to hit waves. And a lot of times, I don't know if you guys have ever surfed, but basically, like, you paddle into a wave, right? And a lot of times you miss that first wave. You're paddling, but maybe you're not catching it. But then because you're paddling, you catch the second wave. And I think, Payson, there was actually a meme that came out around the time that you started your podcast where it was like 50 people on a wave, and it was like all the podcasters of 2019 or whatever. That was the joke. But it's funny that you continued to paddle, to continue the analogy. Like, we all continued to paddle and we caught different waves at different times because we were following the thing that we actually wanted to see happen. We were in love with telling the history and having these conversations. We were the people that were also consuming the content that we were creating. That was it. We just kept paddling because we loved that part of it, and the waves kind of come as you go, right? And so, Dylan, you caught this wave, or now you've got events and you've got all these other elements to Free Trail. Payson's looking at the next waves that are coming, but like, you're still in this forward movement. I don't know. Does that track for you guys, or am I
Yeah.
way off?
Yeah, I
Totally.
think one thing I think a lot about too, because sometimes, using your surf analogy, if you're a semi comfortable surfer, maybe a wave comes and you're like, I don't know if I want to paddle into that one, but I'm going to do it anyway. Like this has kind of been my experience with this YouTube extension of the podcast now. Is it's kind of like, it's almost against my better judgment to dive into YouTube properly, because we've sort of been on a cadence of every other year we'll do like a half-hour length film, like an adventure film. And it's just something that I need. I love making films. I love making films that are really challenging and require a whole bunch of fundraising and pulling a crew of 10 people together, flying to the other side of the world, doing something crazy. But like jumping into the actual YouTube grind, committing to doing something almost monthly, is a little bit against my better judgment, just from a bandwidth standpoint, but also the number of like day in the life series right now is melting my brain. Like, if I just pull up YouTube and I just Google, or I just search like pro cyclist, I swear it autofills day in the life. And like there's 5 riders on every single World Tour team who are doing their own little day in the life thing. And cutting through all that noise is daunting for sure, and does kind of go against my better judgment. But I think one thing that I've sort of surrendered to is that as a person, I have to create. Like, I just have to make stuff. And if I have an idea, I really, really need to see it through. And I have belief that what we're trying to do with our little YouTube thing as we, join the fray is different. And even if it doesn't end up being different enough to really cut through the noise, I need to see it through. And it kind of goes back to the pre-Red Bull days when I would have these not great ideas, had way less experience. I was doing these like weird newsletters, and they weren't always good, but when I saw it through, I learned stuff. And I think because of that, because of following through and like really following that creative itch, you get a better sense for like what's going to work and what's not going to work. Stuff sometimes may still not work, but I think, if you're a creative person, you literally can't say no. You have to do it.
I've got to imagine that creating YouTube content is going to have an outsized impact on what you're able to do with the podcast as far as discovery goes. Because we've been talking about this a fair bit. The loyalty to the podcast is high, but the discoverability is low. And by extending to YouTube and creating more YouTube specific content, you can at least leverage that algorithm, give people more surface area to interact with you, and make it easier for them to kind of follow the breadcrumb trail to the actual podcast, which is sort of the main thing. I do think that from the outside, it seems like, what makes it special for you is that you have an actual like racing career that's in full blast mode right now, where the podcast isn't necessarily, if it gets a million views or it gets one view, it really sort of doesn't matter because it's already scratching the creative itch for you, where if it doesn't get mega views, it kind of doesn't matter, which is probably a better place to be creatively to test and learn new things. Whereas for the two of us, like, we sort of depend on our content performing at a really high level. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about just how the podcast fits into your overarching kind of program.
The podcast, man, that's a great question. How would I describe it in terms of? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, real quick, I think we could paint an interesting contrast here, because to me, observing what you do, Payson, the podcast is an extra incentive for brands to partner with Payson, the individual. Free Trail, the way I've set it up now, and the way that you're maybe going with Pace, is effectively independent of Dylan Bowman, right? And more as I move towards like official retirement, it's like brands are working with Free Trail, right? And so, and operating more as a traditional media company would, with deliverables against that. And I know you've done a little bit of both, but it feels to me like, really it's about Payson McElveen and you being this great athlete in your community, and a way to tell deeper stories that are beyond just Instagram social posts. And that partnering with you, Payson, the athlete, there's like a supplementary value to the brand to be sort of at least connected to the podcast unofficially. Am I interpreting that right?
It's well said. It's well said. And, I think because it's so regular, we do a minimum of one episode every week. It becomes almost somewhat amorphous, depending on who I run into at an event or who reaches out via email. I might be the guy that did such and such result. Oh, by the way, I have a podcast. Or I might be the podcast guy who also races. So it kind of depends on the situation. But I think for me, like the hierarchy when I wake up in the morning is I fuel to train. Training comes first. I train. When I'm training, that's all I'm thinking about, with the exception of if I've procrastinated researching a guest a little bit, maybe I'm listening to a podcast interview with the guest that I'm doing an interview with in a few hours. But it's training and racing comes first, no question. And then the podcast very much is second. And then any sort of media, any media beyond that is I spend time on when I have time. If I have some spare time, if the opportunity presents itself to make a film, great. To make some sort of little series, great. To do a little written piece, great. But there's really like two drivers for me professionally, and it's the racing and it's the podcast. And I think I need to credit Lutzi with this again. I can't remember exactly, but we just made a commitment from day one that we were going to do one episode every week, and we were never going to skip a week, no matter what. And it's just a rule. Like, unless you are sick or injured or something like that, you're not going to skip a workout. You're not going to skip an interval set. You're going to commit and just see it through. And same sort of thing with the podcast. And I think that's been so huge, because it's created trust. And also, for whatever bit of algorithm activity there does, happen on Spotify and the others, when you're just pumping out content, that looks pretty good for just staying relevant, I guess.
Long-term consistency over short-term intensity.
I mean, it's the same with training, honestly. And I've thought about this some too. I've really, this is a whole other story, but in the last couple of years, I've really found a different level performance-wise with this coach I've been working with, and a lot of it is just a reorientation of effort and regularity, and oftentimes just training less hard, but kind of in a more consistent, sustainable way. And the same goes for the podcast. Yeah.
Lessons from sport apply everywhere in life, including to business. Speaking of which, let's talk more about the business of Payson. Obviously, we don't need to reveal any confidential details here. The thing I'm curious about is like the team. From what I recall, your sister was working with you on the podcast, and I think your wife Nicole is also sort of like a core part of the team. This is very similar to what we do at Free Trail too. My wife works full time on our business too. So maybe talk about the team that you have working with you, the pros and cons of like keeping everything in the family, so to speak.
Yeah, it's funny because I think this has become apparent over the last year or two, and I mean this in all seriousness. I think I actually have some pretty severe ADD that was never diagnosed, and I'm curious if it's one of the reasons I've also gravitated towards individual sports. So I played basketball in middle school and high school, and really enjoyed. I enjoy basketball. I potentially follow it as closely, if not closer, than professional cycling to this day. But I just didn't thrive in that team environment. When I'm alone, focused on a workout, I'm just able to focus like nothing else. Like it's me and this ride, and those are the only two things in the world. When it comes to running the podcast and kind of the day-to-day maintenance of the career, I don't always thrive. And so I'm very lucky to have Nicole, my wife, and very lucky to have Lily, my sister. Nicole is basically a born project manager. I mean, she's just incredible when it comes to pulling all the strings and keeping things in line. And so we're very much a team of three at this point. Nicole's producer, Lily's editor, and I'm host / idea guy. And we're just a really solid team. I don't see it expanding really beyond that anytime soon, just because we're all sort of at this homeostasis of sustainability, and Nicole has crazy projects going on outside of my career. But she's really, once she sort of took over management of the podcast, we quickly realized how much more she could help by taking over and managing my career. So she has all kinds of spreadsheets, she's got QuickBooks rolling with, all the invoicing and everything. And I knew that these things existed, but it was never within my capabilities of actually executing on them. Like that is not my strength. So I'm very lucky to have those two women in my life for a whole bunch of reasons, but keeping the train on the tracks is a big piece for sure.
I'd love to dig into the business of Payson a little bit more too, especially with, the podcast itself. How do you sort of separate the two, or is it sort of like it's all one package deal when it comes to, you know, ad reads on the podcast, for example, are you trying to pitch those out separate too? Is that a value add when it comes to your partners? I mean, surely they get the benefit of you producing this content on a weekly basis, but what does that side of the business actually look like for you, and how does that play
Yeah,
out?
this has actually been a really cool way to learn also, because it's been an interesting window into how brands work that is different than athlete specific marketing. It's very adjacent, but oftentimes I could be working with a completely different team, definitely working with different budgets usually. And so it's been really interesting to kind of feel out how all that works. And one of the big lessons is, as much as we like to hear that there's these tried and true systems and ways that marketing works in the outdoor industry and all that sort of thing, brands often are, I've found, almost as unique as people's personalities. And there's just so much variation of what they're looking for, what their goals are, where they want to invest, who they want to partner with, all that sort of thing. And also that those things change over time. One thing I really try to prioritize is long-term relationships. I try to change sponsors very, very rarely. So I get to see brands change, over the course of 6, 8, 10 years. I've seen, Osprey is a great example. Like, they were acquired by Helen of Troy a couple years ago. And I remember when they were a very successful, but still, I don't want to say humble by any means, but very like tightly knit, local feeling brand over in Cortez, just over the hill from Durango. And I felt like I could have just strolled into the office there, know everyone by name. But what came with that also is that they often had constraints when it came to what they could do with partnerships on the podcast, or, different content projects we could do. And they have been able to maintain that family feel with the employees, and I still feel like I can stroll into the office. But with Helen of Troy now being involved, when it comes to the podcast, they're one of our biggest supporters. Every year, are
Same.
they? Cool. Yeah.
Yes. Shout out Vince Mazuka, who is a listener to the podcast and a former guest here on the podcast too. So yeah, they're great supporters of Free Trail. Yeah.
It's so cool because it feels like something that we've both always wanted. And a lot of things can happen when an acquisition like that takes place. Sometimes some not so fun things. There can be a lot of turnover. It very easily could have gone the other direction, but it didn't. And instead, our relationship has just been so elevated. And one of the big ways is the podcast. So I guess that's one example. Just to kind of quickly put a bow on it, we do run them as separate entities. So all of my personal athlete contracts are under one S corp, and then the podcast is under an LLC. This is a lesson I actually learned from Sasha DeJulian, who I think was my third podcast, maybe. I sat down with her in Boulder, and she was just talking about how she was doing her 10 a.m. on a Tuesday series, and that one of the best moves she ever made was creating her own production company. And at the time, I was like, holy shit, what does that mean? Like, that is leagues above what I'm able to do. I can't wrap my head around that. But she sort of explained it and helped me understand the benefits of owning your own content and the different doors that could open. And so, yeah, about a year later, I went that route, and it's not nearly as scary as it sounds. And it's been a really good move.
Explain that a little bit more. I think people would be really fascinated about just that back office, how you're structuring things practically, S corp versus LLC. This is stuff that I wrestle with too myself, but I'm especially interested so there's Payson McElveen, the racer, as a company, and then there's what will be With Pace, the media production house. I mean, to me, I don't think there's a lot of athletes who set themselves up as an S corp.
Yeah, I mean, so being an employee of your company is advantageous for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, to put it bluntly, one of them is just taxes, for sure. But just in terms of organization, being able to add, make Nicole an employee of Switchback Sports, which is my, the athletic side of things. has, you know, a set of benefits, but it's also just from a contract standpoint, it's so much cleaner. And honestly, I think it might sound kind of silly, but it creates like brands kind of take it a little bit more seriously to an extent. If I say, hey, we can have a contract for my you know, athlete endorsement component. If you want to do with this do something with the podcast, you have to deal with this other company. They're kind of like, whoa, okay. And just having separate contracts is really nice. And a couple of years ago, or I guess a year and a half ago, I left the agent I was working with for a few years because I kind of finally had the confidence to do all this stuff on my own. And I realized I had enough relationships and I had a good enough idea of my value to do it on my own. And being able to kind of present these two separate entities rather than them getting muddled and getting into tough conversations where it's, you know, a brand might say like, oh, can you just throw us a couple podcast ads? Or, you know, I really think you should throw us a couple podcast ads because we support you so well. It's like, yes, but the podcast has its own set of employees and its own set of expenses and, you know, its own travel budget and, you know, all of these different things that should be separate because it's a completely different project. And for all intents and purposes, I work for two companies. I work for my athletic company and I work for my podcast company. So there's definitely some paperwork advantages, but there's also some intangibles when it comes to, you know, the brass tacks of the actual conversations when you're, you know, creating deals and all that sort of thing.
Lutzi, is that common?
What
I
for
mean,
athletes to
well,
have?
right. So Red Bull is contracting with Switchback Sports, not necessarily with Payson McElveen, even though obviously they're interchangeable in this case. But at least in my sport, I doubt there's any professional athletes who have themselves set up as an S corp, so that they could do things like Payson has in terms of hiring employees, have tax advantages, etc.
A lot of the relationships that we do have through athletes that have agents, of course, we'd be paying the S corp for that agency, and then the agency would then pay the athlete, right? So, actually, it's not that uncommon. It would say like for the benefit of this athlete, or you know, where the agency kind of sits in the middle. Payson's just kind of taken that all under his own kind of program. Actually, related to that, Payson, I think there's a lot of maybe up and coming athletes that are asking this question too. Could you just quickly go down sort of the pros and cons of having an agent? Because I think a lot of people look at that and saying like, I'm not making anything, and I bet if I had an agent, they could take me from 0 to 100. Where I think like probably, and you could probably articulate this better, but you need to be at a certain level before you actually need or want to have an agent. And then again, like you kind of graduated out of it, but I'd love to hear kind of from you what sort of the pros and cons are, or maybe just the advice that you're giving. I feel like this is a really common topic between athletes of like, should I get an agent?
Two things. I think that there's two things that I think it really depends on. One is just like you're saying, the phase of the career that you're in, the phase of your career that you're in. And two, just personality. You know, I know veteran athletes who wouldn't touch a contract negotiation with a 10-foot pole. They just do not have the personality for it. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with invoicing. And that's completely fine. I don't think anyone should feel guilty for having an agent or not having an agent. I think answering the question of whether you should work with one is trial and error for sure. I got one in large part because I was dealing with a really, really challenging decision about whether to leave the second largest bike brand in the world for a really tiny one or not. And I just really wanted industry counsel, like someone who has seen a lot and could tell me if this was a completely psycho thing to do. And then also play them against each other a little bit, you know, actually do some negotiating to find market value. Because at that point, I mean, and this is pretty recent, this is like 2021. I didn't yet have an appreciation for how business worked within the industry, and that yes, you can be friends with people at a company, and yet when it comes to money, they have a job, and their job is to make their budgets work and make their roster as badass as possible. And those interests might not always align with your interests. That's just basic business, and feelings can get hurt for sure. So during that phase, I am very grateful that I had an agent. But now, I have such an incredible support system of partners who I have really good relationships with, that I can have very honest conversations with them about, hey, we've been together 10 years. How are your budgets looking? I did this. You need this. Let's work something out. And I don't have to pay, my agent 10 or 20% of every contract anymore, which helps me a lot. So, and I also just get to have a little bit of a closer relationship with those brands as well, which I really do value at this point in my career. I just turned 32 a couple weeks ago. So it really depends on a lot of factors. There are athletes who are, 36, 38 years old who still would never go without an agent. And then there's athletes who literally never have one. And then there's athletes like LeBron James who start an entire agency of their own. So there's a whole bunch of different directions you could go.
Who knows? Maybe switch back sports at some point,
Unlikely.
You'll be that go-between. Yeah. It leads me to actually want to just ask you a broad, open-ended question that you can take in any different direction, which is just sort of like the business of gravel and mountain bike racing at this point. You can take it from an athlete's perspective, just the brand perspective, the event perspective. But, Aaron and I talk about this frequently. The bike industry, it's no question, has been in a weird moment where coming out of COVID, obviously people were dealing with a lot of inventory issues. It's taken a long time for the brands and the market to metabolize all of that. And I think there's probably downstream implications to you, both as an athlete or as a content creator, or at least you're in a great position to comment on it. But also, you were doing mountain biking and gravel racing before it was this like exploding subcategory in cycling. So yeah, take that word in whatever direction feels best.
Yeah, boy, it's been a crazy ride. And I think, oftentimes, I'm sure you guys can relate to this, when you're just living day to day and you have a job that happens to also, kind of be a passion project, you can really almost have trouble seeing the forest for the trees sometimes, because you're so close to it and you're so passionate about it and you're just solving problems. As soon as you solve a problem, you're looking to solve the next problem. You're looking to make the next thing. And so one thing I've tried to be doing a better job of is zooming out now and then and just sort of reflecting a little bit. So I've started doing some journaling over the past 6 months or so, just to kind of like take some quiet moments and sort of take stock. Because if I think about where my career is right now, I can critique it and think about a whole bunch of things that I want to improve about it, wins I want to get on the board, blah, blah, blah. But if I look at it in the context of 5 years ago or 7 years ago, it's kind of unbelievable how things have changed. I mean, I remember less than 10 years ago, we sort of had the cross country series here in the States. And unless you were knocking on the door of a podium of a World Cup and on a trajectory to go to the Olympics, you probably did not have a career in the United States. And now with the explosion that we've seen in gravel racing and just mass participation events in general, whether it be the Leadville 100 or you can name any number of events, I don't know how many athletes are making a full-time living, but it is a multiple more than 6-8 years ago. What's interesting now is it's grown so much and so fast that it is influencing European road in a really big way. And so in European road, you have all of these divisions of teams. It's much more like traditional sports where you have the World Tour, and then below that you have Pro Tour, and then you have Continental, and then you have Club. It's almost like European football or soccer or something. And so riders are constantly, rising through these ranks or maybe moving down in the tier of teams. And so you have all of this talent because cycling is such a big sport in Europe. The talent pool is just way bigger because so many more kids dream of being a professional cyclist in Europe than they do the States. That you have all of these really talented riders kind of stuck in these like second division teams, third division teams, and then they see gravel over here where with it seems like, you know, some serious careers popping off, and you know, riders like Keegan Swinson turning down world tour offers to stay in gravel. And they're like, maybe I'll kick the tires on that. And so, yeah. And so you start getting these riders you've never heard of that have been stuck in whatever sort of medium road life cycle, just haven't broken through for any number of reasons that aren't talent related. Because the sport is just so complicated. And you just get some random guy that wins like a massive race. And then it's like, well, how do you value that? You know, he's got 200 followers on Instagram, or maybe he just started an Instagram after he won the race. No one knows who he is. No one knows if he can win on a different style course. No one knows if he's going to be here in 6 months or he's going to be back on his small Belgian Conti team. Do you give that person a contract? What does the structure look like? Like, what is the value of, and so I think it's a really dynamic time. And then you also see events just splintering. You know, you have US gravel, you have the Lifetime events, you have the Gravel Earth series, which is global. You know, there's races in Iceland and Singapore and South America, all over the place, but there's like 40 of them, and it's really hard to keep track of the point series. And then you totally fragmented. And then you have the UCI series, which is basically a form of road racing. A lot of the courses can almost be done on a road bike. There's a lot of crossover between road riders just looking for a different challenge. So
that was kind of the controversy around the World Championships last year, right?
Yeah. I mean, he could just drop in and, you know, ride 35 mil, 38 mil tires. Half of it was paved. There was no cap on the number of starters or roster spots per team. So I think Belgium had like 40 guys. The Netherlands had like 30 guys. So they just fully locked up the first 8 rows. Like half the race was riding for Van der Poel practically, you know, in terms of like tactics and everything. So it's carnage is the short answer. And the big question that you asked, and sorry, I'm kind of long-winded, is like, what does the industry do with all of this? What does that mean for future riders? Those of us who have kind of been in it are somewhat insulated, in part because of what Lutzi started all this with the podcast. You know, we're sort of like entities in and of ourselves, and there's a certain stability that comes with that. But in regards to how the sport as a whole matures, I don't think anyone has any idea. I think it could go several ways for sure.
This is like the perfect for the surf analogy, right? You were paddling into the wave, and then this big gravel wave came, and you just happened to be moving in that direction, and you caught it.
Brilliant,
which is amazing.
Lucy. Great callback. Right? Amazing. Boom. Yes.
I became a big wave surfer without even realizing what was happening.
Hey, but you were doing the thing, you know, and it just happened to thing. So who knows what the next wave is going to be?
And you know where my brain went, Lucy, is like, what a great time to have an off-road cycling media company that really covers this dynamic moment in the history of the sport while things are super fragmented, while the industry is really trying to figure out what the future is going to look like. And in a lot of cases, Payson, it looks very similar in trail running. And that's one of the things that I think has benefited Free Trail, is just this massive growth momentum in the category itself has been a tailwind for us. And there's just always stuff to talk about because the sport is exploding. And so I don't know, just an interesting time to be thinking about this rebrand and this expansion potentially with Pace. There's nobody better positioned than you to comment intelligently about this and contextualize what's happening in the sport, both for fans and consumers, but also for people in the industry.
No, it's funny you say that. And I mean, I don't want to, take more credit than I'm due, but I do sometimes find myself watching, say, the coverage of an event happen and think, man, what if I just took one event off and like solved all of their problems about their coverage right now? Like, this announcer doesn't have the faintest idea what they're talking about. They've never been in the front of one of these races. They're trying for sure, but like, why are they not doing this? Why are they not doing this? And damn, I have to go do this race. And like, I want to try to win this race, but also I really think I could help them right now, you know? So um, I do sometimes find myself like living in two worlds. Again, going back to the fan thing, because if you know, the first Belgian waffle ride just happened back in Arizona, for example, and I'm just refreshing the Instagram stories, and even the Instagram stories just have me so riveted. As groups come together and someone makes their big move, and it's just like there's so much potential, and it's such a blank canvas, and it's almost like if someone says, hey, you get to, as a sport, you get to paint a new picture and you get a canvas this big. And then an hour later, they're like, no, actually, it's this big. No, actually, it's a mural. And like the canvas just keeps getting bigger. And it's like, man, what do we do with this thing? And one thing that I love too is it's been such a reflection of culture. Like in the US, the mass participation events are just thriving so much because it's a community sport. It's a community activity. And over here in Europe, the conversations are very often about how do we make it more spectator friendly? How do we televise it better? And the conversations about in theory, the exact same sport are completely different based on geographically where they're happening. Anyway, things I think about on long rides.
Really fascinating. Is there anything else we want to cover? Are we going to do a BPC today?
We gotta BPC it up.
All right. Payson, this is amazing, man. We should definitely do this more often. And I think, as it relates to just like what you're building, both on the media side, which I think is fascinating and has just massive upside. Yeah, I mean, you can always keep us informed about the dynamics, the economics, about being a professional cyclist too, I think in a way that our audience would find really interesting.
Of course, yeah, I'd love to.
Should we close it down, Lucy?
Yeah, let's do it up.
Okay. Payson, you're our guest. You know this whole brand product content segment that we do? You come
sort
prepared?
of. I'm
Okay,
sort
you get
of
started.
like waffling a little bit because I don't know if it's inbounds. One of them is probably inbounds. The other's like really sort of hippy dippy, but I guess I just call back the journaling thing. As cliche as it sounds, I have, going back to living in this cauldron of content, it's so easy to be immersed in it and be inspired by it and just, pulling up one YouTube video after the next, and feeling really inspired, but then sort of like putting that inspiration away and not doing anything with it, maybe, if that makes sense. And I've started writing more, and what I found is that I really appreciate it being just pen and paper or pencil and paper. Like that physical exchange to me feels meaningful, especially in this incredibly digital age. And then also another piece of that is I'm very fortunate that I get to travel a lot these days to race, and I get to travel to really, really cool places. And as part of the explosion of gravel, people are just starting gravel races and off-road races, mountain bike races in every corner of the world. I was in Morocco last week, and 2 weeks ago, it wasn't even on my schedule. And I had just the coolest time in Morocco, and the journal entries are things that I'll hold on for a long time, and just sort of like getting a little read on the growth of cycling in Morocco and a couple of really interesting people I met in Morocco and what matters to them in the future of cycling. So just journaling, like really reflecting on the experiences we have, has been super, super valuable to me recently.
Payson, there's this thing I got to show you. This is called the 5-year journal that I've been working with for about 4 years. But basically, if you look, this is actually, I got a new one. But basically, there's 5 areas on each page, and it has like the date on it, and you can actually just go and do that, and that way you come back to it the next year. You can read and really reflect and get good perspective. My other one, I'm actually on year 4 right now, and it's so fascinating to go back and see how far we've come, because I think, to your point, right, things have come a long way. There's a quote that I love that's like, people overestimate what they can do in 1 year and underestimate what they can do in 5. And I think this journal is a really good way of doing it. So if you're journaling, you may want to pick one of these up, because it's...
Somebody else recommended that to me recently, let's see.
Yeah.
They're so good. So good. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, but also...
It was one of the camps that you actually made happen, Lucy, at Red Bull, a bike team camp. And it was Brock Rayford, who BMX guy. still on the Red Bull roster, who a little bit of a quieter guy at first, and I wasn't really sure. We were sort of sitting in a circle, and it was Kate, Richie Rude, Brock, Joel Kittner. I forget who else was on that camp. Carson. And we were doing this exercise where we were basically tasked with just sharing one skill that we felt had been helpful to us in the recent past. And Brock, of all people, was the one who stuck with me the most. And it was very basic. Just like, think about where you were 5 years ago. Just like, think about, we're always thinking forward, what we want to do next, but take that time to think back a little bit. Knowing history in general is important, but knowing your own history, I think, is important too. So it sort of ties into the journal thought there, and it being a 5-year journal is interesting. I haven't seen that before. That's cool.
I love Brock. I love Brock Greatford, by the way. That guy, just an incredible human being. And he's a beast on 2 wheels, but also like off the bike, one of the most fascinating people I think I've ever had a chance to know. He's amazing. We got to get him on the pod, actually.
Okay, I'm going to go next. I'm going to go next because I just want to build off what Payson's talking about here. Matt Trappy, friend of the podcast, sent out an email today for Montour Sportif. Lucy, did you get it?
Have not looked at it yet.
He just put out a film called Anton's Journals. I have not watched it yet. When I clicked on it, it only had 15 views as of this morning. But since you guys are talking about journaling, I feel like we should shoehorn this into the convo here today. But effectively what Matt did was make a film about Anton Krupicka about his 30 years of running journals. So like in the body of his emails, it says, Anton reads an early entry as a 12-year-old before his first marathon, his thoughts the morning of 9/11, and he shows us the images he chose to glue on the covers of his running journals. So that's going to be must-see content for the second.
Man, that's so cool. And again, like what a gift that is.
What a great idea for content.
That, and
Beautiful.
also just for Tony too, like to have the foresight to, I don't know who told him at 12 years old to start journaling, but there's just no replacement for that. And I think it's such a human thing, just written personal history is such a valuable thing, and just adds so much context to our lives. So that's way cool.
Yeah, it's so funny too, because Anton's writing has influenced the sport of trail running more than anybody else's. Speaking for myself, coming up in my very early 20s, it was his blog that really spoke to something in my soul and really making me want to develop the curiosity to go do this stuff myself. But it's so cool because like he's clearly so gifted with it, but it's something he's been honing himself since he was 12 or maybe earlier. So anyway, just everything that we do has positive and negative implications further down the line. My real contribution to BPC is the telepathy tapes. Have you guys heard about this? It's this new viral sensation podcast. Really, really interesting. It has nothing to do with outdoor sport, but I'm actually trying to diversify the content that I consume now, because I realize all I do is listen to business podcasts and read business books and think about business. And the telepathy tapes is a good palate cleanser from that stuff. And effectively what it's about are basically nonverbal autistic children who have shown evidence that effectively they can read people's minds. I know that sounds completely crazy. You guys have to listen to this. It feels to me like, the next Serial, a podcast where like everybody needs to listen to it, and that it could single-handedly onboard millions of new people into listening to podcasts. It's fascinating.
Okay.
The telepathy tapes.
Good to know. I'll write it down.
Wow. Bringing the heat today, man. Calling your shot.
My point is actually, Lucy, it's what you talk about is like a piece of monoculture, in this moment where everything is segmented, fragmented, divisive, polarized. This is the type of thing where nobody's going to be offended. Nobody's like going to have their identity challenged, at least from my perspective. And everybody's going to learn something and be inspired. Really good stuff.
Cool.
I dig it. All right. Well, I actually, for maybe one of the first few times, brought product to the pod this time. I want to shout out. I got my hands on a pair of the 510 Freerider Pro boas, And I know you guys have both individually worked with BOA on multiple occasions, but I just got like my first mountain bike shoes that have the BOA enclosure on them. I ride flat pedals. I don't run the clip-ins or anything. So there's never really been a shoe that had that kind of BOA thing. But oh my gosh. And obviously, Dylan, I've got the Speedland shoes with the BOA enclosure. But to have them for mountain biking, it like completely changed my stance and control on the bike to have that level of security. And I don't know. Game changer. I don't know. Simple one, but honestly, like I haven't had a shoe like that, and I dig it.
I can't believe people still tie their shoes and boa
I know.
exists.
I'm done. I am so
It's
done with laces.
2025,
Boas
guys.
are
Come
sick.
on. Who
Boas
ties
are
their
sick.
shoes?
Yeah, imagine if you're riding through like creeks and then dust all day, and your shoes are just constantly shrinking and expanding. And yeah, boas are sick.
Yeah.
What have I been doing with my life, you guys? I haven't had boas this entire time, and now I do.
Oh yeah. Boys, that was great. Payson, thanks so much for coming
Thanks
on
for
the
having
show.
me. It was fun. Keep up the good work, guys. It was great to see your faces again after way too long.